16 on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's a pup named Scooby-Doo on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Baby Looney Tunes on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's BAKUGAN Battle Brawlers on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Batman, the Brave and the Bold on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next is Ben 10.
Coming up next, it's Ben 10 on Cartoon Network.
Ben 10 Alien Force is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Ben 10 Alien Force on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Ben 10 Ultimate Alien on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Chaotic on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's an all-new Chaotic on Cartoon Network.
Chopsocky Chooks is coming up next. Chowder is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Chowder on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Codename Kids Next Door on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Courage the Cowardly Dog on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Courage the Cowardly Dog on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Camp Lazlo on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Ed, Edd and Eddy on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Foster's movie House of Blues on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Foster's movie Destination Imagination on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Goosebumps on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the premiere of Goosebumps Welcome to Dead House on Cartoon Network.
George of the Jungle is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's George of the Jungle on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Generator Rex on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Hot Wheels Battle Force 5 on Cartoon Network.
Johnny Test is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Johnny Test on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Crypto the Superdog on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the League of Super Evil on Cartoon Network.
Naruto is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Naruto on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Mucha Lucha on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's My Gym Partner's a Monkey on Cartoon Network.
Pokemon is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Pokemon on Cartoon Network.
A new episode of Pokemon is coming up next. Pokemon 3, the movie, is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Pokemon Movie 10, The Rise of Darkrai on Cartoon Network.
Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, Battle Dimension is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, Battle Dimension on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, Galactic Battles on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Robot Boy on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Robot Boy on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? On Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo's Arabian Nights on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Alien Invaders on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Monster of Mexico on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Pirates Ahoy on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Where Are You? On Cartoon Network.
Skunk Fu is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Skunk Fu on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Star Wars The Clone Wars on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Stoked on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Teen Titans on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the grim adventures of Billy and Mandy on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Garfield on Cartoon Network.
The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's the Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the Mr. Men Show on Cartoon Network.
Up next, the Powerpuff Girls continues on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's the Secret Saturdays on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's a new episode of the Secret Saturdays on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's the Superhero Squad Show on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry Blast Off to Mars on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry the Fast and the Furry on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry Shiver Me Whiskers on Cartoon Network.
Total Drama Island is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's Total Drama Island on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Total Drama Action on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's an all-new Totally Spies on Cartoon Network.
What's New Scooby-Doo is coming up next.
Coming up next, it's What's New Scooby-Doo on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's an all-new Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Adventures in Babysitting on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Batman, Mystery of the Batwoman on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's the Billy and Mandy Underfist Special on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's CASPER'S Scare School on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, Garfield Fun Fest on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Garfield Gets Real on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Kangaroo Jack Good Day USA on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Home Alone 3 on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Scooby-Doo The Mystery Begins on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Teen Titans Trouble in Tokyo on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Open Season on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scary Godmother 2 The Revenge of Jenny on Cartoon Network.